it on? Hi, just a quick announcement. There are bathrooms in that back hallway if you need to use them. We're about to get started in a few minutes, but just wanted to let you know. Thanks.
If you could please take your seats, we will begin momentarily. Good evening. My name is Juan Ramiro Sarmiento. I am the Senior Advisor for Public Policy to Mayor James, and it is an absolute honor to be here with you tonight. Welcome to the KC Race Equity Initiative's Socialization and Bias program. Today, we'll hear from Mayor James and participate in a race and equity training and presentation led by race and equity trainers Paku Her and Molly Fleming. You received some cards at the beginning of the program, so if you have any questions, please fill those out and hand those over to our ushers who will be on either side of the auditorium. Now, today we're going to be talking about some serious and personal stuff, so we have a few guidelines that we want you to keep in mind. So first, be respectful. We realize talking about race can be a little uncomfortable and sometimes upsetting, but we ask that you respect your neighbors and participate civilly. So if you find that you're unable to do so, just take it outside so that your neighbors can continue to participate in the dialogue. Second, turn off your phones and put them away. We'd love for you to share your participation in this with others, but while the presenters are up here, we ask that you participate fully. When one person takes out their phone, it spreads like wildfire, and we lose a whole section of the audience. It's distracting to you and those around you, so if you need to look at your phone, please excuse yourself from the auditorium. And as it was mentioned before, the restrooms are in the back, so if you need to take a break, you can go ahead and step back there. Lastly, respect your peers' anonymity. We're going to get a little personal today, and we want everyone to be honest, open, and vulnerable. I ask that all of you, including any friends of the media, respect the privacy of the personal conversations that will be taking place here tonight. So now, without further ado, please help me to welcome Mayor Sly James.
Well, good evening, everyone. We're in church now. Good evening, everyone. Now we're talking. I want to start by saying thank you to everybody for being here, and I want to thank the Mohart Center and the city, our partner, obviously, and the Community Alliance for Racial Equity. CARE is a new organization that's working towards building a community of stakeholders and activists and organizers, trainers, and educators around a common vision of what racial equity in Kansas City should look like. They're a critical partner to the city moving forward in these efforts, and they've worked with us closely. We're also joined by other critical community organizations, Urban Summit, Showing Up for Racial Justice KC, Race Project KC, the Missouri Poor People's Alliance, or campaign rather, Open Table, Cultural Competency Collective, and the Kansas Missouri Dream Alliance. Many of you can connect with them after the program in the multi-purpose room. They've been starting these conversations in communities across the city to lay the groundwork for conversations just like this one. And for that, I am extremely grateful, so I want to thank them for that. Tonight, we're going to continue the conversation that we started last month and take a look at ourselves, a real good, close look at ourselves. We're going to talk about our behaviors, whether they're intentional or not. We're going to talk about how they maintain the status quo and enable racial inequities to exist and to grow. And it's going to get a little personal. It's probably going to get a little uncomfortable. But I'm really asking you to lean into that discomfort, because by doing so, we will open ourselves up to real honest discussion. It's a discomfort that we can uncover truths about ourselves and begin to disrupt our own habits and behavior. So our collective power as individuals gives our systems and institutions power. So if we can change the way that we behave, we can also begin to change the systems at large. So thank you again for showing up today. We're taking another step towards a common language, a common understanding of how racial inequity affects our community, how it's shaped our very society. It's a common step towards understanding how these systems have advantaged some and disadvantaged others. And even more importantly, it's a step towards that we're taking together. And that's extremely important. The only way this is going to ever work is if we work together. Even more importantly, it's a step that we have to take if we are going to continue to grow as a city and to overcome the things that we often take for granted or simply don't see because we're not looking. I know that when we come together as a community, we have the ability to make long-lasting, sustainable changes in chronic problems, but we have to do it together. So thank you for being here, and thank you for coming to be a great part of this. We couldn't do it without you. You've taken time out of your week to come here, and you've made some kind of an effort, canceling plans, leaving work early, getting a babysitter, having somebody else walk the dog. But we're grateful for that, and we want to make the most of your time, so I'm going to make a few important asks of you over the next 90 minutes. Be open, listen, commit to engage. Like Juan Ramiro said, please turn off your phones and put them away. We can check our fantasy leagues later. I will be doing that late tonight so I can get my team in order for Sunday. But put them away tonight and commit to listen, to reflect, to discuss, and lean into the discomfort. I'm asking us all to work together to make Kansas City an equitable place for everybody to live. So let's get the conversation going. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mayor. And now I'd like to take the time to introduce our presenters. Paku Her is a principal of the Chang Development Group, a consulting firm that provides lectures, workshops, transformative leadership coaching, and organizational and grassroots strategy development designed to build racial equity and create systems of change. She holds over 20 years of anti-racism organizing experience, a decade of which she spent as the director of a national racial equity training program with Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training. Born and raised in the Midwest, she takes great pride representing AAPIs living in the nation's midsection and believes there are invaluable stories to be told by people of color living in the most rural areas of the United States. Molly Fleming is the founding executive director of the Missouri Organizing and Voter Engagement Collaborative, MOVE, and MOVE Actions, C3 and C4 coordinating tables, catalyzing political transformation in Missouri. As a community organizer with over a decade of experience in grassroots voter engagement, Molly is a strong strategic planner, trainer, and collaborative facilitator. Before leading MOVE, Molly directed the PICO National Network's faith-based campaign to end predatory payday lending. Organizing hundreds of clergy and community leaders across 7 PICO federations, Molly helped lead the national campaign to enact strong rules to curb predatory lending from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. She is also a founding organizer with Showing Up for Racial Justice Kansas City, Search KC, which organizes white people as part of the multiracial movement to confront, disrupt, and dismantle white supremacy. Now, please help me to welcome them to the stage.
There's a mic here, too. Cool. That's just down there. Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see all of you. I'm going to figure out if I can turn this on. I think I can. Can you hear me? No. Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. We'll just use this one. It's great to be here. It's nice to see some faces. I know there were some folks who were with us in August. Was that August? Yes. A couple months ago. So it's really great to see folks. It's also great to see some new folks coming in for this conversation. I can't reiterate enough what Mayor Sly James said, which is thank you for taking the time to be here. Of all the things you could do on the first sunny evening we've had in weeks, what it feels like, I'm really thankful to have you here. I'm here with Molly. I want to tell you a little bit more about who I am, and Molly will get a chance to tell you a little bit more about who she is, and then we'll jump in. I live here in Kansas City. I've been here now 13 years, so I think I'm a Kansas Citian at this point. My spouse and I moved here from Chicago. And we moved to Waldo. We're right between Waldo, Brookside, like Romanelli Gardens. We had no idea what Kansas City was like. what we were moving to. We had 3 weeks to sell our place in Chicago and get here, and we were like, I guess this is a fine house. And it took us a while to get settled. It took me a while as an Asian American who understands myself as a progressive to figure out who are the folks in town doing organizing. It took me a long time to find folks. I looked diligently for about 3 or 4 years. And then all of a sudden, it felt like this door opened. I don't even know what it was or what happened, but I started finding all kinds of really amazing, incredible people doing workers' rights stuff and housing rights stuff and racial equity work. And it started to help me feel like Kansas City was home. And so to be here, standing in front of you now, working with the mayor's office, working with CARE, working with all these other groups who were tabling when you came in to sign up, feels really exciting. It feels very different for me than it felt when I moved here 13 years ago. And that's a really incredible thing. I said this at our first session in August, which is, you all are coming into a conversation that is not new. This is not like this is the first time people had this conversation in Kansas City. This conversation's been happening for generations here in this town. And something feels rich and different. There's like an opportunity that exists here, and it's up to us to identify what that is. So I'm really pleased to be here. A couple other things that you should know about me. I'm a parent. I have a child sitting over here. So if she becomes unruly, it takes a village. So you got a room full of parents. Whether or not you have children in your life, you can be a parent tonight. Try it on. You might like it, or you might decide it's not for you. Which is okay too, because some days I'm not sure it's for me. But she's here. I'm really pleased to have my kids here. I'm really excited and proud to be a parent in Kansas City, particularly. There's some really exciting stuff happening with parents doing good work in this community as well. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to give Molly a chance to tell you a little bit about herself.
Thanks, Paku. So my name is Molly Fleming. The pronouns I use are she, her. And I do a lot of stuff in my day job that you may have heard about already, in Move Action. But I'm here tonight really representing Surge and showing up for Racial Justice Kansas City, which, at the origin story of Surge, which is a group that does focus on organizing white people as a part of a multiracial movement, we heard a lot of white folks. So you're getting a lot of white folks in a room, and those white folks are trying to figure out racism together. And there's a lot that can go really wrong there if we're not being really intentional about how we're showing up and how we're showing up with clear accountability and what our role needs to be in a multiracial movement and not a movement just led by white folks. But it has been a deep and critical space that has challenged and agitated me and helped me get clear about my power and the power that we can have as we work together to really confront, disrupt, and dismantle white supremacy culture, which we're going to talk about tonight. And so my roots in that and my clarity and the importance of that come from growing up in this city and being a multi-generational person in the city. As far back as we know the names of people in my family, they are from this city. And as much as there's so much that I love about this city, including our wonderful baseball team that's going to be even better next year, I grew up feeling very powerless here. And I grew up in a working class household that sometimes struggled, and I felt powerless for that reason. But I also grew up traversing across a lot of our lines of demarcation and asking questions as a kid about why sometimes I lived in neighborhoods that looked this way, but I went to schools that looked this way, and not getting any real answers. And that just made me feel very powerless about any ability to disrupt it. And so what's been very empowering for me is moving back to Kansas City over 10 years ago and learning about community organizing, which is ultimately about how ordinary people come together to build power together to disrupt oppressive systems and structures. That I both have hope and I have clarity, and I'm equally excited about the room that we're in right now and the work we're going to do tonight. So one thing I've gotten really clear about in organizing, though, is that the first revolution is internal. So a lot of our work tonight is, what is that internal revolution? How can we be doing that together? And how can we be doing that in clear-eyed ways where we still value each other, but we're being real about the world we live in? So pass it on to Paku.
I think this mic works. Thank you. Okay, so you know a little bit about who we are. One of the things that's really important for us, if I can get to the right slide. Okay, this works. We just want to give you a very quick overview of where this conversation emerged, this particular conversation in this series of 4 that the mayor is leading in Kansas City. We got here because a lot of folks were saying, how could we figure out across the city, how can we figure out ways to help people have conversations about race? Because generally, you can check it out for yourself, generally most folks don't necessarily have really good, great, like humanizing experiences talking about race and racism, right? So raise your hand if you've ever had a really terrible, terrible conversation about race. Where like you went in and you're like, this is gonna be great, and then at the end everybody's crying and hates each other. Yeah, so we figured there was enough of that experience that we didn't want to repeat that. There's a plethora of that. What we want is to figure out, okay, could there be something that we can do in Kansas City that will give people some real skills, not just like experience in talking about race as some big concept, but real skills to understand how does it show up in our lives, and how do we have conversations about it, not just to have a conversation about it, but to understand it well enough to do something about it. That was the big vision. And so lots of people were having this conversation in lots of different places. And then there sort of emerged this natural thing happening where several groups are saying, well, what if we could figure out how to do this in different ways all over the city? What could the impact be if people in nonprofits, if people in city government working in public departments like the health department, if people doing grassroots work, if people doing community-based orgs, could we figure out how to get everybody talking with the same framework around race? What could the impact be? Now, I'm also, one thing I didn't say, that's maybe it was sort of implied in my bio that Juan Ramiro read so nicely, it's a really long bio, is that I'm also a community organizer. So my whole lens on the world is to say, how can we build power to produce outcomes that are better for people in communities? Where people aren't dehumanized, disenfranchised, marginalized. How do we do that? And we do that by building power, and we do that by building power across lots of different areas of our city. So what's happening now, the groups that you saw tabling are not just interesting groups that you might want to connect with. I mean, they are super interesting, don't get me wrong. But they're all groups that are in some way or another participating in a much larger strategy in this city. If you could imagine everybody part of this being a part of a web, trying to build some skills to tackle and deal with race, that's what those groups are. That's what's happening here. That's what you're a part of tonight. So surprise, you're part of a much bigger strategy. And we're really happy that you're here. So that's a little bit of how we got here. Tonight, we're gonna talk a bit about, well then how does race work? So the first session in August, we just gave people, we did some digging at like a definition. We'll talk about a definition of racism, but it'll be very quick. It will not be like we did in August, which was really a big chunk of what we did in August. But we will review that because it's really important that we all at least start on the same place with the same kind of language. So I'm not asking you may not buy it for the rest of your life, but at least for tonight to make sense, we'll talk a bit about what racism is very quickly. And then we're going to talk about the behaviors that we learn when we live in a racist society. There are behaviors that we learn, white people and people of color, wittingly and unwittingly, that engage us in this big system of racism. And we'll talk about why it's important to identify behaviors. And then we'll talk a bit about how that shows up in your life, how it shows up in this community, where you work, where you worship, where you do your life, how those behaviors show up that we've been socialized to have or taught to have around race, and what we can do about it and how we can disrupt it. So that's the big roadmap for the evening. Now, you'll see it's laid out in sections. So we're going to talk about racism. It's systemic. So we're going to clarify that. We're going to talk about racial identity development. What happens to our identities when we live in a society structured around race and racism? And then we're going to talk about, okay, now, let's talk about behaviors. I said this in August, and I say this to a lot of folks. We can talk about racism as some big construct or some big concept. Some might even call it a pathology. But it's very hard to stop a pathology. Like, it's very easy to be intellectual about it, but it's very hard to say, oh, there's a construct here, it's fake, it's not real, or it has real outcomes. We can have all kinds of intellectual conversations about it, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're learning how to do anything about it. Which is why then we're going to talk about behaviors. Because if we can identify behaviors that support what we will be talking about around white supremacy culture, if you're getting itchy because we said white supremacy, we'll talk about that in a second. But we're going to say, well, if we could identify behaviors we don't like that produce a particular outcome, we could change that behavior to produce a different outcome. That's very different than being like, let's have an intellectual conversation about, critical race theory, which, I love to do, but it doesn't necessarily help me get to behavior. So that's what we're going to do. And then we'll spend a little bit of time offering you some ways to think about how we disrupt those behaviors and what that looks like. So that's the flight check. All right, this is where we're flying. If you meant to fly somewhere else, you can get off the plane now. Nobody will be mad. Just, know that that's where we're going. So very basic ground rules, super basic, because, if you raised your hand because you once had a horrible conversation about race, I raised mine very high because I've had many of those. Oftentimes, we don't create any kind of expectations about how we're going to treat each other in those conversations. So these are the very basic rules that Molly and I bring for the conversation tonight, which are we will explore and engage some content. We're going to reflect and apply that content. So when Mayor James and Juan Ramiro said, we're going to ask you to get a little personal, we're all going to ask you to think about your own life. We're going to ask you to think about your life in Kansas City, how you grew up, what you see in your own life. So we're going to do that. We will not blame and shame each other. Listen, this whole system was rigged before we showed up. So, we may not have set it up, but we're real good at living in it. So we're going to talk about what that means. But we will not blame and shame each other. There's no expectation that everybody who came into the room tonight is in the same place in terms of your understanding of how racism works. I don't expect that. But I do expect that we will respect one another enough to know that this is a self-selecting group that cared enough to show up tonight. So it's not like somebody came in here because they just heard about this thing called racism this morning and they were like, oh, I guess I'll just come to this. I don't think that that's the case. So let's at least offer each other some credit for showing up. And then we won't avoid or derail the conversation. It might get itchy, it might get sticky, it might be hard, right? You're in a room of people you don't know and we're asking to be vulnerable. That's tricky enough as it is. But I'm asking you to please try to hang on to the conversation. And if you get into a tight spot, ask yourself, why does this feel tight, rather than running away from the tight spot? So those are the basic agreements. Does that make sense to folks? Molly, is there anything you want to add to that list? Okay. So I do want to be fully transparent. So Juan and the mayor asked all of us to turn off our phones. I'm not going to turn off my phone because my Google Docs are on this, which are my notes. So I will have this here, but please know I'm not updating my Facebook status from up here. But just so you're aware that when I look at that, I'm just looking at my notes. Okay, so let's talk about race. We want to spend just a few minutes saying, what do we mean when we say race? So this is another, yes? Oh, I can slow down. Yes. You too, Molly. It's not just me. I'm not the only one getting called out. Thank you for that. I just get so excited. All right, I will slow down. We both will. Thank you for asking for that and letting us meet your needs. So, when we talk about racism, I asked already how many folks in this room have had a not so great experience with racism. Raise your hand again. Talking about racism. How many folks in some of those not so great experiences discovered that the people you were speaking with about the issue of racism maybe had different definitions of what racism is? Yes. So this is, unsurprisingly, a challenge. When folks talk about racism in the United States, we often have as many definitions of racism in a room as there are people in that room, which is really kind of bonkers because we live in a society very, very much structured by race and racial identity, and yet we don't have a common definition of what that means. So raise your hand if you were taught that racism is about your attitudes, whether or not you have a prejudiced bone in your body. Has ever thought about that? So raise your hand if you thought, oh, this is an individual thing. Clearly individuals are learning biases and prejudices, and that's what racism is. So raise your hand if you've ever been taught that. I have. I'm not asking if you necessarily believe that. I'm asking what were we taught? Now, raise your hand if you were taught, actually, racism is like when people are stopped by the police for their racial identity, or when schools are not fully accessible to people of different races. Raise your hand if you learned that that's what race was or is. Okay, so here's what I want you to hear in those two definitions. The first one, around individual attitudes and actions, really is about personal stuff. Like, if I can excise my racial biases, then racism is not a thing. It's all about whether or not I can be okay or non-racist in a racist system, which is important to do. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be working on their attitudes and actions. Absolutely. But something else is also happening. Something else is happening that has nothing to do with whether or not I am racist or non-racist. Right? That thing has to do with, if I can rid myself of all of my racial prejudices as an individual, then does that stop racial profiling? Just think about this. Does that stop inequitable access to housing because I changed my attitudes and actions? It doesn't. It doesn't. So then we have to say, there must be a relationship here somehow. There must be some relationship between individual attitudes and actions and something else happening, which is what I call systemic. Right? Something different than if somebody calls me a racial epithet when I'm walking down the street. That might hurt my feelings, but it doesn't impact whether or not my children have access to culturally competent education based on their racial cultural identities. There's a different thing happening there. So what I want to propose to you is that we need a definition that can hold all of that. Right? We need a definition or a common language that helps us talk about racism and understand, yes, there's individual prejudice, but we think that individual prejudice or bigotry isn't just what makes up racism. Because obviously there's this other systemic or institutional piece. So we can recognize, it's bigger than just my attitudes and actions. So we need to think about, what happens then when individual attitudes and actions become a part of our systems and institutions in our society? We have to be able to combine those two things. So hear me saying, clear as day, it's not that people shouldn't be working on their personal prejudices, but that alone will not solve racial inequity. Right? The idea, as an organizer once told me, a woman named Barbara Major, black woman out of New Orleans with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, said, "Honey, the goal is not to be a rose petal in a cesspool." That's not the idea. So here's what we want to propose to you. To make sense out of our conversation tonight, but also because this is the framework that the mayor's office is using for this entire series of conversations, and this is the framework that groups all over this city are using to talk about race and racism. So when we talk about racism, we're talking about race prejudice, there's that individual piece, plus the misuse of systemic and institutional power. So that means every racial identity group in this country has that first piece, that racial prejudice. Every racial group, whether you identify as a person of color or a white person. You cannot live in the United States and not have learned some of the biases about other groups and your own group. But that alone is not in and of itself racism. Like, I could have a racial prejudice that says, I think the food of my people is the best and everybody should eat it, which is like fairly benign kind of a thing to think. All the way to thinking, my people are superior and we should run the show. But even if I thought that, unless my society's institutions made everybody else live by my bias, that's not racism. This is the thing we want you to hear, right? There's power here that we have to talk about. So this is what we're working with. And this, I think, is what will help us make sense of a conversation tonight about, then how do we learn all these messages? Because I don't know about you, but I didn't agree to some of the racial messages that I learned. I didn't say yes. I didn't stand in some line and say, yes, sign me up for all this bullshit. I didn't do that. But when something becomes systemic, it does not require your permission, your consciousness, or your ongoing knowledge of what has happened. And this is true in a system like this for both white people and people of color. And we're going to dig into that and figure out, well, what does that mean? What does that look like then? Without shame. Like, we're not here to shame and blame, remember? We're here to say what is. If we were to look at Kansas City and talk about race this way, systemically, institutionally, what do we see? And so we're going to do a little social science around that. Do you want to add anything, Molly? Are there any pressing questions that somebody has? We don't have a lot of time because we want to make the most of our time together this evening. But I just want to see, is there something that really needs clarifying, something that doesn't make sense? Is there anybody for, yes, I see it. Is there a mic that we can bring to this person here?
We know that when you fill out an application for employment or any type of application, you will have race on the application. Why is that so important to have that on? I mean, with all the education that we have, people are obtaining master's and doctorate degree, I don't see why that would be on it. I mean, that's just not something of a real qualification. So that would be my question is, and if that's the case, then it should be like some type of a vote that we can take it off all applications.
Wouldn't that be something? If we could take racial categorization off of every application, and yet racial identity matters, and how we count folks also matters. So this is the funny thing about race. So I'm going to peep you to something. The construct of race is fake. I know. I saw somebody go, just clutch your pearls now. Now's the moment. The hell? Nobody told me it was fake? This is fake? Yes, it's fake. There's nothing anthropological about it. There's nothing biological about it. It is made up. And it was made up at a particular time in history. A particular time in history. And it was created by folks. Now, I'm not saying this to shame anybody if you have ancestors from this place. I'm just telling you what is historically true. It was created by Europeans. But not just all Europeans. Europeans who became white ethnic Europeans at the time of worldwide expansion. So you remember all that time when people like Christopher Columbus were sailing their ships around the world and discovering stuff that people already knew was there? Right? That was a period of time when people started using all of these structures of race. Now, if you were a colonizer sailing your boat across the ocean to discover new places when really you got lost, and you were starting to define race, you happened to be the definer of race, and the people like you were actually the superior race, so there's just a coincidence. Just a coincidence. Why in the world do you think people were defining race and using that fake concept of people being different phenotypically? That means how you present, but for all kinds of other reasons. Why would those colonizers have been using race and saying, this is a really good thing for us to use as we sail around the world and find stuff? Yes, I see a hand here. Just shout it out because we don't have mics out there. Yes, so this person here says there was a reason to exploit people and the resources of those lands. Now, hold up. That's not how I learned about Columbus. I learned that it was real nice and that the Indians were real good to them. I didn't learn that he killed a bunch of Indians either. I didn't learn that stuff. But I'm not saying that to make people feel bad. I am telling you what science shows us about this fake construct and how it became real. So the construct is fake, but the outcomes are real, and we're living in it. We are living in it, and we're trying to figure out, well, now we want to have racial reconciliation. What does this mean? Now, we could do a whole other night, and maybe the mayor, we can have another session just talking about the historical development of racism. We don't have time to do that tonight. But I want to illustrate to all of you that race is fake, but the outcomes are real. And the outcomes teach us behavior. So we can talk all day about Christopher Columbus. We can talk all day about missionaries. We can talk all day about how Native American people got put in reservations and how children were taken out of communities and had the Indian taken out of the Indian. We can talk about all that in another session. But what I want you to hear is that in that moment when colonizers said, oh, we're going to use this fake thing to say we're superior so that we can go and take stuff, that's like saying, I like this car, it's mine. That's how colonization works, basically. Like, it doesn't belong to you, but, oh, I really dig this car, I'm going to take it. That all of that is about systemic power. Institutional and systemic power. So that's like a quick and dirty, that could be like a whole college semester lesson in like 2 minutes. But that's the connection I want you to see. So Columbus may have been acting out his own personal biases when he showed up, but he was also representing an institution called the Church of Spain and exercising power. Make the connection. Nobody needs to feel guilty about it. I'm just saying this is just what it is that we're proposing to you. So, if that is the case, then what we want you to think about is that something happens to us as people when we live in a society where institutional power shapes how we understand race. So there's a couple things that I want to share with you here. When we talk about race and racism, it's not just about things being unfair. Like, yes, we can identify, as if you were here in August, Dr. Sarah Martin gave us all kinds of incredible data to show us how race plays a role in creating inequitable outcomes in healthcare, longevity. I mean, we could have lots of conversation about that. So yes, all of what gets externalized about institutional racism that's visible to us, where we can count the numbers, that's legit and real as a real outcome. But there's this other thing that happens. This other thing that happens at the level of our psyche. I'm not trying to get woo-woo on you. Like, I'm really saying something happens to us psychologically, developmentally, that you didn't have to agree to, you didn't have to say yes to, you don't even have to like it now, but it happens. When you are in a community of people, just think about how children grow up. Children learn all kinds of things from school, from families, from the cities and neighborhoods where they live. They learn those things in community because a community teaches us how to do life in any number of ways. So I learned how to do life as an Asian American kid. I learned how to do life as a poor kid. I learned how to do life as a Southeast Asian refugee. I learned life in all the ways to do womanhood and girlhood. I learned all those things because I'm part of a group that shares that identity that taught me how to be in the world. I didn't just wake up one day and decide that I was going to have certain beliefs about what it means to be a woman, or decide that I was just going to have certain beliefs about what it meant to be a poor Southeast Asian refugee. I learned those things because I was in a group that shared that identity. And I didn't even really know how it happened. I just learned all kinds of stuff. That's the deeply psychological stuff that also happens around race. Because being part of a racial group teaches us all kinds of things about ourselves and all kinds of things about people of other racial groups. This is happening all the time. All the time. There's lots of data about it. There's lots of studies about it. We could get like super wonky and like really into it, but we won't do that tonight. But you can find all kinds of data and research about development, identity, and race, and how that happens unconsciously, and at a very, very young age. So by the time you're an adult like me, it's been working on me for 42 years. It's been happening already for a long time. And maybe I'll wake up and see it, and maybe I won't. But it doesn't mean it's not happening, even if I don't see it. So what I want us to recognize here, I opened the session by saying, well, We could have a big theoretical conversation, but big theory isn't necessarily how you stop something that is hurting people. Right? Like, I mean, I almost became a philosophy major. Apologies to any philosophy majors in here. Until I discovered that, like, oh, like, I could sit around and philosophize about all kinds of things, but that wasn't necessarily going to change what I was philosophizing about. Is that a word? Maybe it is. If it's not, it is now, because I just made it up. But for us, if we can recognize, now I'm going to invite you to think about psychology, behavior, health, and how that expresses itself. Sometimes I tell folks, when we get to this point of talking about race, which is not often the place where we talk about race, we don't often talk about race at the level of how it shapes our psyches, our minds, and our unconscious behaviors. When we get to this place, it makes me think about all of the sessions I have sitting on my therapist's couch. She works with me doing cognitive behavioral therapy. Right? So cognitive behavioral therapy means, oh, I can step back and with awareness, see what I am doing and see what behavior I'm exhibiting, and then say, oh, that behavior is leading here. Maybe I want to stop that behavior. Because if I can stop that behavior, my risky hypothesis in life is that maybe I will discover something else. That happens here around race. This is the invitation tonight, is to say, okay, just hang with me. Hang with me till 8, and you can say this is the biggest load of you know what you ever heard. I'm not offended, but just hang with me for a minute. That if we're talking about a psychosocial process happening around race that leads to behavior that reinforces a racist construct, consciously or unconsciously, by people of color and white people, then it requires that we build some awareness to recognize the behavior, build the cognition or the ability to see it, and then say we're going to change that thing. If we could change that behavior, it's likely it will lead us someplace else. So that's what we're going to try to talk about. We're going to talk about, okay, so how does it show up? If we did learn about race, how did it show up? Do you want to add anything, Molly?
One thing I'd add is we pivot into what those behaviors are and the manifestations. My good friend, some of you know John Trammell, who also does organizing work with Surge KC, uses a metaphor to think about how this is often happening in the world. Because I think when we see that big definition of racism, that's real and it's lived, and then it can sometimes feel disconnected from who we are and our power and our behaviors. And it feels like there is like a flood coming into our neighborhood, and it is inundating all of the houses in our neighborhood. And we are trying to figure out, like, if we can see it, if we acknowledge it, how do we work together to sandbag the neighborhood? And what we often aren't conscious of or choosing to acknowledge or looking at, especially for those of us who are white, brothers and sisters and co-conspirators in the room, is sometimes we're worried about the flood in the neighborhood and we're holding a garden hose in our hand and it's on full blast. And so a lot of what we're going to pivot into tonight as we talk about manifestations and behaviors is a double consciousness of how do we see the flood and think about as a community, what does it look like to sandbag our community and stop the flood and stop the source of the water? But what's coming out of the garden hose in my hand? And how do I individually think about my own behaviors and how I'm contributing to this flood?
Thank you, Molly. So Molly and I want to introduce you to some definitions. So we started with a definition so that we're super clear about what we're talking about tonight. Now, we want to propose to you that there are some ways to define the buckets of behavior socialized in people of color when we live in a world that's run by racism that we can talk about, and that those behaviors happen to show up because of a process that we called internalized racial oppression. Internalized racial oppression. We will use IRO a lot, just to shorten that. But there's a psychosocial process that happens for people of color. There's also a psychosocial process that happens for white people. And that process is called the internalization of racist superiority or racial superiority. Now remember, we're talking social science, we're talking individual identity development and group identity development it does not mean you have to like it. So we want to talk about what is. So we want to give you these definitions. We're going to start with the definition on the left. So the definition on the left of what internalized racist oppression is for people of color is that it is a complex, multi-generational socialization process that teaches people of color to believe, accept, and live out negative societal definitions of self and to fit into and live out inferior societal roles. These behaviors support and help maintain the race construct. It doesn't mean you necessarily believe them in your conscious mind. But something happens. When you swim in the water, you're going to swallow some of the water, and this is what happens. Will you read the
Internalized racist superiority, a complex, multi-generational socialization process that teaches white people to believe, accept, and live out superior societal definitions of self, and to fit in and live out superior societal roles. These behaviors define and normalize the race construct and its outcome, white supremacy culture. I'm going to read that last sentence again. These behaviors define and normalize the race construct and its outcome, white supremacy culture. And that normalization of the white supremacy culture is the piece that we're going to spend a lot of time thinking and talking about today, that this is something that because of the culture that we are a part of, not something your mom taught you or something your grandma taught you or something you saw on TV, all those things might contribute, but the culture all around us is influencing our behaviors, our sense of self, and that manifests in our actions.
I just have a question. How many people got itchy when you saw white supremacy culture? It's okay. Some people got itchy. Did anybody was anybody like, oh, hell no, I'm out of here. I'm not going to have that conversation. I want to be really clear about what Molly and I mean when we say white supremacy culture. When you saw that, did anybody think of pointy white hoods and burning crosses? Did you? That's what I was taught to think of whenever anybody said white supremacy. White supremacy, anything. That's what it was. What we're proposing to you is that white supremacy and how we normalize it is much bigger than pointy white hoods and burning crosses. That there's something happening that all of us are aware of, engaged in, or otherwise contributing to, that allows for people to march with tiki torches and not have anybody hold them accountable for it. Now, this is a trip because then it means, oh, dang, all of us are responsible for something here. All of us are responsible. I might be really mad at those people carrying tiki torches. I might be really mad at people who look like me, Asian Americans, saying that unarmed black men should be shot because they should just listen. Do you hear? Like, there's all kinds of stuff happening, and we're going to dig into that. There's all kinds of stuff happening that means we're all engaged in a culture. We are all engaged in it. So this is not a conversation about, like, who are the bad guys and who are the good guys, and thank God we're the good ones. Like, that actually isn't a useful framework. What is a more useful framework is to say, what is the big picture? And while I might not be engaging in the most obvious, public-facing, forward-facing, egregious racist behavior, I am still a part of this system. And I learned something here. Me individually, me, my community, me, the people who look like me, every racial group, all of my group memberships around race and identity taught me something about this culture. So I want you to just suspend, if you can suspend it enough, that we're not saying anybody in here is burning crosses. We are saying, come and have a step back. Take the 30,000-foot view. That's what we're asking you to do. And then say, how are all of us falling through the ether in the 30,000-foot view? Okay? So, thank you. So we want to say, in order for us to have some conversations about our behaviors, we want to propose that our behaviors emerge in some pretty specific ways. Now, think of them like buckets of behavior. Our internalized racist suppression as people of color and internalized racist superiority for white people emerged in all of these buckets. The first one is like on an individual level, how I understand myself as an individual. Individual white person, individual person of color. For me, that means individual Asian American, Pacific Islander. What were the messages I learned about myself that shape how I interact with white supremacy culture and engage in it? The second is what I call intra-group relationships. That means, how do I relate to the people in my own racial identity group? So how do black people relate to other black people? What are the messages that shape relationship? And how did white supremacy get its hands into that? Native people with native people, white people with white people, Asians and Asians. You get the idea. The third bucket, or manifestation of behavior, has to do with our intergroup relationships. That means, how does our socialization, our IRO and IRS, show up when we interact across racial identity lines? What happens when you put black people and Arab Americans in the same space? What are the messages that showed up? What happens when white people are in the same space with Latinx people? What happens when we're interacting with one another? What messages did we learn there that show up about ourselves and one another? And then finally, because if that wasn't just totally off the rails enough for you, it gets even more off the rails. When you put a bunch of us across all of our racial lines into historically white institutions or into a society or community that is driven by white supremacy culture or white as normative, then all kinds of stuff happens. All kinds of behavior shows up, and all of us end up participating in this game we call white supremacy culture. So I will just share with you before we give some quick examples, and then we're gonna actually have you meddle in your own lives and talk about this. I will just give you a quick story. When I first learned about this structure, when I first was told that maybe as a person of color I was culpable in white supremacy, I didn't take it real well. Because I was like, oh no, the problem is white people, clearly. The problem is white people. I was also 19 and self-righteous, so that didn't help. But I learned with a really incredible mentor, a woman named Miss Ann from the Deep South. She's the person who has shaped so much of how I understand racial equity work. Older black woman, incredible, incredible woman. She sat me down and she said, you know, all this talk about like the man, who's the man? We're gonna go after the man, all the people who are the man. She looked at me and she said, honey, and I was really young. She said, honey, you know we are the man. You know we are the man too. And I was like, Miss Ann, this is not true. And she said, oh, honey. And you know, like, and she was a maternal figure, and she was so generous and kind with me, and she just kept saying, oh, honey, it's true. It's true. So this is as much an invitation for people who identify as white, who came to this conversation tonight because you want to do something good, because we're all the good ones in the room. Remember, we're the good ones. We're the good ones who showed up. That there is perhaps something else happening here for us to work on. And that for people of color who showed up tonight, that perhaps we got some house cleaning to do that has nothing to do with white people doing their thing. And has everything to do with what we learned about how we treat ourselves and one another and the behaviors that we practice. So just hold that. Hold that. Okay. We're doing on time. So I'm going to just give quick example. Molly and I are going to give one quick example for each of these buckets. And then we're going to ask you to turn to a neighbor and have some conversation. So just get ready. Just get ready. This isn't going to be like lecture all night. So for me, when I think about people of color, self-esteem and self-concept, behaviors emerge here around performance all the time for people of color. So like, how many people of color in this room learned that you have to work twice as hard to go half as far? Right? I have not met a person of color from different identities of racialized people of color who hasn't somehow learned that message. Now, I also learned an interesting message, which was not just about like, oh, I have to prove that I'm good enough, smart enough, can do this. I also learned messages that were like, oh, well, if you want the job done right, you should hire a white person. I learned those messages too. So that was about, yes, we might say on the face, that's about, oh, well, white people are better. I learned that message. That's sort of like, again, that's like the Kool-Aid everybody's drinking. But the underlying message about my individual self was that, like, oh, well, of course I'm not good enough. I ought to believe that I myself am not good enough. So we should hire a white person to do it. Or we should get a white teacher. Or we should do whatever, where whiteness is better than me. I had one of my nephews, who is now like 24, he's out of college. He learned the message around performance and intellect, and check this, every community of color, I think this is true again, but I'm just using an example from my own life. He grew up, he's mixed race, but he looks Asian. You wouldn't necessarily know that his mom is white, because he presents very, very much as an Asian American child. And he grew up in Wisconsin, in a small town, where the kids who were put in remedial classes at school were kids like him, Hmong refugees, Southeast Asian refugees. So there goes your model minority myth of like Asian Americans being the smartest ever, and how people get treated. We'll do another night on that. But he's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. As a child, like when it came to dinosaurs and facts about dinosaurs, he was like a savant at 3. And he went to school, and he was put into the remedial classes because the kids who looked like him were in that class. And he started to learn the message that he was dumb. He didn't start to learn the message, he started to believe that he was dumb. He started to believe that he couldn't succeed. So he started to internalize those messages about his intellect, his ability, his skill, his talents, because somebody else made a racialized choice for him. He didn't agree, his parents didn't agree, they didn't understand. They were like, oh, guess we believe our teachers in this little white town, of course. They're the experts. That's how the socialization happens.
So as Paku named, internalized racist oppression and internalized racist superiority are in a dance with each other, right? And so I learned from a very young age that if I worked hard and I played by the rules, I would be successful in life. And that has mostly been true for me. And I learned that I got to be treated as an individual, that I was unique, and that anything I did, right or wrong, I would be judged on my individual merits and for my individual actions and not for my racial identity group. And I also learned implicitly, nobody ever said this to me explicitly, but I learned implicitly that whiteness was normal, that I was normal, I was the default, if that makes sense, which made other people in my consciousness, therefore, something other, right? But I was normal, I was a default, and therefore my experiences were like the typical experiences and should be expected to be that. And it's taken me like more than a decade, I'm still in the middle of this, but unpacking that normalization of my whiteness as a part of my identity, not like owning that I was a white person, right? I'm just a normal person. What that meant in terms of the privileges I've been afforded, but also like my self-identity. Really, right? Because I think there's a lot of us white folks who actually feel defensive when our white identity is named, even though it is a real reality, right? Because it's been so normalized for us. So to point that out makes us feel defensive. And so as we continue these manifestations, I invite all of my white brothers and sisters and co-conspirators in this room. Paku named what we often call the good-bad binary, and that's real. So like shuck off that good-bad binary. There's not evil racists and then good white people who come to important trainings in the evening. That these lean into all of us.
So the second bucket of manifestations is our intra-group relationships. So if I'm learning messages about myself and my individual racial identity, I'm going to also be learning them about the people in my own group. Right? And if I'm not learning particularly good messages about myself as an Asian American or as a person of color, then it's likely that those same things I'm learning about my family members, my community, the people who look like me. So that leads to all kinds of stuff. Again, check it out. Like I will share my own experience. I don't expect that to be the pillar of truth for all people of color, but I have worked with very different groups of people of color doing this work for 2 decades, and this always shows up, is that part of what ends up happening for me was that I spent a lot of time trying to distance myself from people who looked like me. Now, in communities of color, there's also a flip side to that, which is also like great and heightened affinity, because where else are you going to go? Like if white society has told you you're not normal, then you will find the people who understand your life experience. Beverly Daniels Tatum wrote a book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Read it. Right? So there's 2 things happening here on this level, just in this bucket of behaviors alone. Right? Which is heightened affinity, because there's awareness about marginalization and the people like you. And there's also distancing that can happen. Now, mind you, this is just one example of many kinds of behaviors. So for me, that meant in high school, I tried really hard to be the white girl. I did all the things that like the white kids did in school, which was like student council and theater, and I was the lead in every show. In fact, I just got an invitation from my high school theater teacher who was like, we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the theater. You should come back and sing for us. And I was like, feelings. I'm having lots of feelings about this. Because that was such a pivotal part of me trying to prove to all of my white friends that I wasn't like the handful of Asian American kids at my mostly white Catholic school in Minnesota. That I was ashamed to be like them. So when my white friends said, oh, you're not like them, I was like, thank God. Because I am normal to you. That normalizing stuff that Molly talked about, that's what that was for me. Now, that's not everybody's experience, but in every community of color I have worked with, that is an experience. The stuff around distancing, the stuff around heightened affinity, all of that stuff emerges here as one kind of behavior.
And in some of my experiences of internalized racist superiority, and I think many of you who are white may have some familiarity with this, there's a different set of conversations white folks often have with each other. When I think about when have I ever heard a racist joke, it has been in a group of white people, or a disparaging remark that I did not interrupt 100% of times that I should have. What are the differences in conversations when white people are engaging just each other and talking about politics and talking about social issues and talking about our community? And then I also think about in my journey, both in organizing and being more clear about the importance for myself and my own self-identity of being an anti-racist, and my like emerging anger with the white identity group that began to manifest as a kind of white guilt and an intentional distancing from my white identity group. So I don't want to own that. It kind of get back to the good, bad binary. Like, white folks are all messed up, so I don't want to own that reality. I'm going to focus on my individualism rather than recognizing I am a part of this racial group. I have influence and power and relationship in this racial group. And to say that I'm distancing myself from it is just a mirage. It's not a reality, right? And so really leaning into a clarity that, yes, this racial identity group has problematic elements that can happen in a group of white folks in which a disparaging remark about somebody's racial identity can be said. But it's actually in owning my actual presence in that racial identity group is where I start to be able to confront and disrupt it and be real about who I am and my situatedness and power in that space. And that is very much a lifelong, ongoing journey. It is trying to walk up on a going down escalator, and you've got to keep moving the whole time. And I have found a lot of strength from trying to be in the middle of that journey and move forward.
The third set of behaviors is our intergroup relationships. So you can do the math. If I'm not learning particularly good racial messages about myself or the people who look like me as people of color, it's highly unlikely that I'm learning lots of great, positive-only messages about other people of color, right? So some of the most awful things I learned about black people, I learned from my grandfather, which is a trip, because he's like a refugee who came here in the 70s, but it shows how toxic and contagious white supremacy culture is. That I would learn it from my own grandfather, who was a prisoner of war in a war that the United States fought that people didn't even know was happening at the same time as the Vietnam War, came here with nothing had swastikas painted on our house, but then said racist shit about black people. Excuse my French. That just slipped out. Like, this is what starts to happen. So then it also tells me, oh, well, then another example is like, there are plenty of people of color who are deeply invested in building a border wall between the United States and Mexico. It's not just white militia people. There are also people of color deeply invested in the way we do racist militarism and racist nationalism. There are plenty of people of color who have said all kinds of things to me as an Asian American about my own experience, who have bought into the myth of Orientalism and the other, which is a totally white supremacist framework. We could trace the history of that. But other people of color drank the Kool-Aid too, so that I can walk into a room and be completely invalid as a person of color. All of these things are happening. So here's the trip. People of color, we don't even need white people around to do this stuff. So remember when Miss Ann said, oh, honey, we are the man. This is what she meant. I don't need white people exercising their conscious or unconscious racist behaviors or biases in the room with me and us for us to do this on our own. Like this, Stephen Biko, there's an incredible quote I always think about for us and around identity. Stephen Biko, an incredible South African anti-apartheid activist, fighter, organizer, no longer alive, said, the greatest tool of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. The greatest tool of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. If you can get me to do the dirty work, I will line up first to do it. If you tell me long enough to go through the back door, and I show up one day and there is no back door, I will make one. This is what we're talking about. So yes, racism is all of the outward-facing inequity we can name for days on end around housing and education, healthcare, and this is also happening.
So as white folks, one of the, not only the greatest tool of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. One of the greatest tools of folks in power is the ability to turn us against each other and to blame each other for our pains and our problems and massive systemic oppression and unequal distribution of wealth. So white folks are really good. It's often been manipulated in us and taught to us by a rich white person who wants to control power and capital, but have been taught that folks of color are to blame for a lot of your problems. It's those immigrants that are coming in, it's those brown immigrants very specifically that are coming in and taking and stealing jobs. It is any version of racial strife that can get lifted up and named as a way to create like tension and discord and a distrust across groups of color. So I think that plays out in lots of meta and macro ways and maybe in amongst folks in your own family. But one thing that has been an important unpacking for me when I think about my own personal internalized racist superiority and how that's shown up in intergroup relationships, I think back how so many of my experiences in volunteering and in my early career had so much paternalism embedded in them. An understanding, and sometimes we use a phrase, white saviorism. This sense that I am an educated person who has learned this set of things, am here and I can save people, right? I don't think I ever thought that explicitly, but that was an underlying, implicit understanding of myself and relationship with folks of color. All of 22 years old, I was a teacher in New York City, teaching a classroom of 12 students who were all children of color, all of whom had been diagnosed with behavioral and learning disabilities. And I remember having such a sense of like my own power and situatedness in their lives that like, despite all of the structural racialization and white supremacy culture and capitalism and poverty and things that were affecting their lives, my 22-year-old self could be there to save these kids from the world and help them get an education that they needed. And that is not to say teachers, even young teachers, cannot have a profound impact on kids' lives. But I have a retrospective of clarity that I realize now was IRS playing out in myself about my role, that I was not explicitly conscious of or willing to own or accept in that space, and has taken deeper work to unpack and think about, and to also be clear, where else could that be showing up in myself and my life more than a decade later, and how am I pushing back against that role, because that's the IRS, and that's not a behavior I want to be manifesting.
All right, so the final manifestation, because I told you if it wasn't ridiculous enough, it just gets even more ridiculous. When you make all of us people of color have to interact with each other in white institutions or in white society as a whole. Now, I want you to think about this, right? The infighting or the IRO that emerges between people of color is almost always about access to resources and power. It's almost always about access to resources and power. So when people of color are going at each other, the core question we don't ask each other when we're acting out our internalized oppression in the workplace or at church or in the community is, wait, so we're fighting for a piece of the pie. Who has the rest of the pie? And also, why is there mold on this piece? You hear what I'm saying? We actually lose our ability to have critical, analytical conversations about what's actually happening around power because we're like, oh, well, you're not going to get my stuff. Now, that sounds glib and flip. While it's true that that is part of what drives our IRO with one another, we are also trying to survive. So I'm not downplaying that either. I am not downplaying. And we have been pitted against each other on purpose. So I made a joke earlier about the model minority myth, right? The model minority myth is the myth that says Asians are the most successful, and we're this close to being white. It's like a very intentional strategy that started in the late 80s. Look at the cover of Time with like the Asian American geniuses. Just look it up, and you can track the way that that strategy was created, not because we're going to someday be white. Surprise, I will never be white. But the point is to show other people of color, see, if you work like those Asians do, I mean, they didn't even speak English when they showed up. Now, if you black people could just work as hard, if you Latinos could just work as hard, if you Native Americans would stop your drinking on your reservations, we won't talk about how you got on a reservation or why alcohol was put onto your reservations. If you don't work hard like Asian Americans, of course it's your fault that you can't succeed. And then our IRO in the Asian American community, for many of us, is like, oh yeah, tell me I'm a good one. Tell me I can be just like you. When that's toxic to us too. So that kind of stuff happens in big ways between people of color. And then there's also stuff that I experience often between people of color in white institutional contexts, which are behaviors where we don't support each other, we sell each other out, we triangulate one another, right? So that like if Lisa and I have an argument, not that Lisa and I are gonna have an argument, but if Lisa and I have an argument at work, one thing I might do is go to our white supervisor or somebody who isn't Lisa, who has power, and say, listen, I just wanted to have a conversation with you. Now, I know you're gonna meet with Lisa tomorrow. She's perfectly nice, but sometimes she can be difficult to work with. I mean, I'm not talking smack about her. I just want you to be prepared for your meeting with her tomorrow, because she's kind of angry. You know, she's kind of angry. She's like, I'm not saying she's an angry black woman, but she's angry. Do you hear all the coded ways in which we do that? So instead of resolving something with one another, we go to the points of power to access power and resources, or to try to gain advantage, or to say, I don't know why you picked Lisa when you should have picked me. All of those things emerge, and that's just between people of color. White people didn't even have to open their mouths to say anything about it.
And from the perspective of IRS, in those same institutions, and in this same white society, we are often much more laterally connected to that power, or we are that white power. But we're not in a space of necessarily acknowledging that our positioning within our institutions may have something to do with white supremacy culture and the white institution and the power it maintains. Because we're individuals and we're unique. And we got here out of all of that hard work, which may be true and may have happened, but it can sometimes be a blinder on seeing the way in which white supremacy culture is showing up in our white institutions. And I think the way that plays out when we start to become conscious of it is we don't necessarily get clear and real how much that is going to take to dismantle white supremacy culture in our institutions. So I remember at a former workplace of mine, I felt so proud because we were doing about 90 minutes or 2 hours of kind of anti-racism / diversity work every 2 weeks. And I remember thinking, we've got it. We've solved it. We're reading articles and talking about them together. It's done. And that is not to say reading articles and talking about them together is not really important. We do that work all the time. We do that work in Surge. We do that work in my workplace. But there is a much more fundamental transformation that is going to be necessary to become fully anti-racist institutions that is pushing back against white supremacy culture. And conversations like this are a part of the beginning of that. And I'm thinking about that in my own workplace now. How do we have a conscious, intentional, and agitational orientation that 90 minutes of a diversity conversation every 2 weeks is not dismantling how IRS is ensuring that white supremacy culture is maintained in our institutions?
So here's what we'd like you to do for just about 4 minutes. It's not a lot, but it's a taste. So Molly and I did our best to give you some content, some context. We gave you some examples from our own lives. Now we want you to turn to your neighbors and ask yourself this question and talk about it. What examples can you identify in your life that illustrate any or all of the IRO or IRS manifestations? In your own life. That's all I'm asking you to do. And then how does IRO or IRS impact how you experience and engage in this community? It's a lot, and we're only giving you a few minutes, but we wanted you to try it. Just try it. So we're going to give you just about 4 minutes. That's 2 minutes a person. If you are sitting by somebody that you know really well and you're really comfortable with, and that's your preference, okay. But I strongly encourage you to turn to somebody you don't know as well and see if you can have this conversation. Because remember, when we started this, we said, we're trying to get nodes of understanding and competence and skill all across the community. So you could try it out now. You could micro-test it now. So give it a go. Turn to your neighbor, chat with each other. Oh, yes. Is something showing? Okay, good. I think what we should do, we'll just do this. Maybe we don't even need to do a debrief of this. Do you want, what would value in a debrief of this, though? It's okay. If we have time at the end. I think there's probably more value in a debrief of this, frankly, versus popcorn questions. Because popcorn questions are often people having statements. This is a question, but I also think we could find this person and talk to them. And we'll answer that. The next session is going to be about this. Super. Yeah, let's do debrief. Let's quickly run through, here's, we want to propose to you some ways to deal with stuff, and then we'll turn it back over to you.
Test.
I mean, body language, people are engaged.
Test.
That's on. You want to press it again, and then it should.
Good to know. Do you want to just hang on to that one, Molly? halfway through.
This is working, right?
Test. Test.
Yeah.
What's that? Now I think the front might not be working. Are we good?
This one? Hello? 1 minute left. 1 minute left. I know I still have like GOTV broadcast. If you can hear me, clap once. Is this on? Can we turn? If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. If you can hear me, clap 3 times. Okay. I'm just going to stand here. We talked so much with that one mic, I think we killed the battery. So I just want to do very, very quick, just like a couple of folks, because we don't have a ton of time. But I do want to just reflect back to you that, like, the energy of the room and people talking, and I'm deeply grateful that you all spent the time to do that, even if it's just for a few minutes to try it on. Are there a couple of folks who'd be willing to share with us just what was it like to have the conversation? You don't need to say what your partner said. You don't have to say what you said. I mean, ideally, don't say what your partner said. But just give us a taste of what that was like. I see a hand here and a hand here. How was it?
Should I stand up?
Hello, test.
There we go.
Yeah, talk loudly and I can repeat up here.
So for me personally, I'm a biracial woman, and I'm a very white Catholic biracial woman. So it was really interesting for me to see this from both sides because I'm the child of an immigrant and someone from Wisconsin. So
Me too.
so it's one of those things where it's like it was an opportunity to reflect for me to reflect both on how in PPR, especially with comments like, oh, I'm a good one, I'm like a white person. But it also, made me reflect on things that we're forced to choose, as a biracial person, you're forced to choose one side of your identity or the other, and that's usually very cemented in white supremacy.
Yes.
This idea that, like, oh, like I've had a number of people come up to me and say, like, oh, you just look like an exotic looking white person. Or like, oh, I can tell you're something, or what are you?
You're racially ambiguous.
Or someone just saying, like, I've literally had people say to me, like, oh, honey, you're white. And it's things like that where it's an understanding of how white supremacy forces us to choose one side of ourselves instead of just, focusing on this big concept of race, when that's not at all how we are as people.
Absolutely. What's your name? So Tia, for folks who couldn't hear in the back, was sharing her experience about what it means to be a biracial person, learning messages of IRO and IRS, but also living in a race construct that forces choice, that forces you to choose. And it's really true. Like, our lives are fluid. Our lives are not lived the way constructs want us to live them. And yet, constructs are real. Right? So I really appreciate you sharing that. I'm the mother of mixed race children too. Their dad is white. And for them, the experience in the world is like they are people of color. They identify as Asian American children and as people of color because they're racially ambiguous enough to not be seen as white. Also because their father and I have made political choices about how to teach them to be in a world that is built this way. But that doesn't mean that at home that's all that they are. It doesn't mean that that's all that they see themselves as. None of us are only our racial identities. And it's very clear that their identities in the race construct and around white supremacy culture is really different as mixed race children who are Asian and white. Their lives would be different if they were mixed race children who are Asian and black. That dynamic. So even when we talk about mixed race identity, I'm not saying that Tia was saying this, but in movements for in multiracial movements, the bias is still always towards defining multiracial identity around whiteness. Like, just check it out. That is some deep stuff. And that the multiracial movement, you can do some checking out of this for yourself too, was first started by a white mom with a black partner who did not want her son to be black. She wanted him to be something else. More deep stuff to research about what's happening psychosocially. But it's still defined by whiteness. I saw another hand. There's somebody here. Yes. I'm sorry, the microphones seem to not be cooperating. You're welcome to come and stand up here. Or stand up and just speak loudly so we can hear you, please. Yes, you, looking around. Yep. You come, please. Unless we can get that mic working. But you are welcome to come up here. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you. The interesting thing I got out of the conversation that I had with the group that I was with is that what it felt like for me is as if we were kind of chipping away at something that's been there with us for a long time, because, you know, when we use the word white person or black person, we seem to have this sense of like of nervousness or fear just to use just the description, because I find it funny when I think back to conversations that I've had, you know, in personal groups and in meetings with people, when you hear a white person try to describe someone of color, they can't find the words without insulting. You know, they're trying to figure out how to say it, and you're sitting there waiting, and you just say, man, just say black person, you know, just say it, get it out, you know. And within our conversation, you know, just to hear us refer to each other as white and black, you know, comfortably is something that I feel we just have to start getting used to acknowledging who we are, but at the same time acknowledging that there is something, you know, in our history that's dark and it exists, and we have to start acknowledging that, because when we don't acknowledge it and hide it, which is what it seems like in the group that I was with, is that we're kind of creeping out of the closet. Just with us as a whole, we're kind of creeping out of the closet and expressing, you know, some of the feelings and experiences that we had. So, like I said, in our group, that's what I kind of felt in our conversation, is that we were kind of chipping at a wall that's been there for some time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this is a really critical thing that we said in August, and I say it to lots of groups. It is not racist to talk about race. Talking about race is not racist. Like, we have to reframe this. Because the way that white supremacy culture works and the way that racism works, it works its best when we don't talk about it. It's like, I come from a family with addiction. It's like we're all like, something's going on. There's an addiction here. But if we can pretend the elephant in the room isn't there, that somehow it's gone. White supremacy is the elephant in the room. And it's not like a cute little baby elephant. It's like dead and rotten. And we're spending a lot of time pretending it isn't there. So it's not racist to talk about race.
So I see a hand there, but I also want to acknowledge that white folks have a lot of internalized racist superiority to be wrestling with. So I wonder if there's any white folks who want to name what their experience was and any reactions. I see pointing. I see a hand right there. Yeah.
Thank you. So we want to thank folks. I wish that we had the time to sit in circles and have more of this conversation. And I hope that even this small taste inspires us to ask ourselves, where could we have these conversations? Because these conversations are actually happening in Kansas City, not just in this auditorium. They're happening in the groups that we're tabling. They're happening all over the city, and you should be having those conversations. A couple of things Molly and I want to say. We did say we're just going to touch on how you could make change happen. I know that it's 8 o'clock, so we're pushing up to our finish, but we want to say a couple of things about how you can interrupt. So the point is not just to be able to say, oh, now I can identify all my behaviors. The point really is identify behavior so we can change it, so you can disrupt it, so we can disrupt our collective behavior together. So one of the ways you can do that is on like a super individual level. For some people, this is really hard, where you can think about, okay, like, how am I going to have that conversation? If your family celebrates Thanksgiving, it's right around the corner, and people are going to have to talk to each other, right? Like, are you going to take the vow of not talking politics and race or not? And what does that mean? How do you build relationships with people to encourage their growth, your own growth? And how do you foster some relationships that will really develop in your mutual consciousness together? A second one is a little bit bigger. So imagine like you're moving outwards a little bit, is this institutional approach. You may work at a school or work at a church or participate in any kind of an institution where there's hunger for this conversation or a need for this conversation. I find that people who really want to do good work around race and racial justice and changing what's happening oftentimes just lack the language and tools and practice. It is not about a lack of desire in communities like Kansas City, but it's how do we figure out how to give people the tools that they can actually use. Not just a great lecture where you learn some interesting content about Christopher Columbus, but you can actually say, oh, when I go back to work, I'm going to put these glasses on and I'm going to see something differently. When I have dinner with my family, I'm going to see something differently. You can do that at an institutional level, trying to create change, trying to spur change, trying to help change that is already happening, to create things like policies and practices and cultural norms in that institution that challenge white supremacy culture. And then the third thing is to imagine what it looks like on a societal level. What does it look like if we were to change Kansas City? What could Kansas City, if we do this well? And I think that we're honestly on the road to doing it well. I've seen this kind of initiative in 20 years happen in lots of cities. And lots of cities really struggle because they don't have a big spider web of a strategy. Cities that have done it well, like High Point, North Carolina, Kalamazoo, Michigan, Seattle, Washington, those are places. Why can't we be in one of those cities? We have the skill, the capacity, the aptitude to do it. And to think about what our impact isn't just here, it's not just here in Kansas City, but it's all over the country. We could have impact. And we could organize for a much bigger systemic change that produces a different life experience for people here and can be a model to other cities and other places. So I know that this was like super, super fast. It was 90 minutes, and even Molly and I didn't actually technically have 90 minutes. It's not a lot of time. But we wanted to whet your appetite. We want you to get a taste of what actually are people talking about in Kansas City. This is it. What does the mayor actually want us to talk about? This is it. This is what we want to dig at. We want to do really serious work to sustain long-term growth. And to do that, we got to have this kind of conversation as well as have all the kinds of conversations about external impacts of racism and racial inequity. So with that, you can contact us. Molly and I live here. Juan Ramiro is here and available from the mayor's office. And I know that we wanted to ask questions. A couple people had questions, and we ran out of time. It doesn't mean your questions aren't important. Please share them with the mayor's office. We did see a couple of questions that are perfect segues into the next conversation, which is happening in January, about how institutions work and how do we actually organize to change institutions. That's what we're going to talk about in January. So I'll turn it back over to the mayor or the staff or whomever.
That was really good. Thank you, Paku and Molly. Let's give them another round of applause. I did want to say for those folks to reiterate, if you had a question and you jotted it down, our staff is around. You can hand it to them. We also have a table outside of this room with a container for surveys, and you can also put your questions there, and we will be working through those as well to answer your questions. So please make sure you take the time to fill out your survey and put your questions there. We're not done. Now, a final word from Mayor James.
Well, first of all, I do want to thank Paku and Molly. They've done an excellent job here of laying the groundwork. But I also want to make sure that I say thank you to my staff. I see a number of them here with my staff. All of the members of my staff, please stand and raise your hand so that you can be identified. There's McLean over there. Is that you, Sandy? All right. I haven't seen you in a while. Sandy just had a baby, and she's been absent, taking care of family, which is exactly where she should be. I know that Joni's around here somewhere, and you've seen Juan Ramiro, and Jessica, I know, is here, and Laura is here. I want to thank them because I don't know that it would do them justice to say that they've worked. Okay, that doesn't work. You know, these things do break. I don't need this one broken. It doesn't do justice to simply say that they've worked hard. They have worked extremely hard, and this work started well over a year ago. We have only begun to scratch the surface. And as a community, we need to continue to scratch until we start digging grooves in the surface. And the way to do that is to talk together, work together, engage in activities that will allow us to do that. And I recognize for the most part, we're all going to return to work tomorrow. We're going to sit at our desks or do whatever it is that we do. We're going to have these ideas in our head. And one of the things we're going to say is, okay, what do I do now? Okay, how do I do something? But in order to ensure that long-lasting change, we've got to continue to work together and to keep talking about the issues. So here's some of the things I'm going to ask you to do. First, realize that each and every one of us have power. The power doesn't have to be given to someone else to stop and to think and to disrupt behaviors, our own behaviors and the behaviors in which we find ourselves in. We identified some of our own biases a little bit tonight, but we also learned how we can hopefully disrupt those behaviors and biases that we have. But it's going to take work and effort. Nothing happens with one meeting. We also learned how that we can disrupt the behaviors in the systems in which we live. And it's evident that every single one of us has some power through our decisions and our responsibilities and who we are. And we have to be conscious about how we perpetuate and uphold the norms that we've talked about tonight. And it doesn't hurt to stop and think and say, now what just happened here and how could it have been different? In the few square feet of space that we all occupy and take up, we can always find ways to make our own communities a little more equitable, a little more racially aware and conscious. One of these ways is participating in the democratic process of voting, and voting for people who voting for policies that make racial equity a priority and that they're not afraid to talk about it when they're out campaigning. It's another way that we can collectively transform our systems and our communities is by putting people in those systems and communities that have some awareness of exactly what we've been talking about here tonight. Next thing that we can do is come back. We're going to be here again in January. January 16th, we'll be right here in the same space. That program is going to dig into power relationships between systems, institutions, and communities. Speaking of that, at the city, we're walking the walk, not just talking the talk. We have a race and equity action team inside the city, which is trying to assess city processes using data, using community input, using guidance from community experts and equity experts like Paku and others, and trying to find ways to make race and equity part of what we do and the policies that we pass and the actions that we take. And we also work with the Race and Equity Institute and the Kauffman Foundation to get that done. So I'm going to ask you to engage in the organizations that are here with us tonight. They can take you to a different level in this conversation, but the one thing that I always say about meetings, I go to meetings, my life is nothing but a long, 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 long meeting. I've got 288 days left of meetings. Meetings are only meaningful when they result in action. So you can follow CARE on social media, you can get their newsletter, you can sign up for that, and soon they're going to play a huge role as a hub for all the resources. One of the other things that will happen as a result of our getting together on this time, the last time, the next time, and the times after that is we will start to hopefully see synergy and collective action of all the groups working together and moving as one large block in different ideas with different team positions to make sure that just like a football team, every organization has a role to play in order for us to win on this battle, to make sure that this city becomes much more equitable, racially sensitive and aware, and that we change our behaviors. So sign up, volunteer, attend trainings, get the resources that you and your organization need. There is nothing that says that the people in this room who've met each other tonight can't get together for dinner, a drink, to read a book, to share their own experiences, to get to know each other. We often sit in rooms like this, but then we go home to our own very plain and same circumstances and forget about it until the next time we sit in a room like this. This room needs to be present in every time that we do things. This is the way business should look. This is the way government should look. This is the way schools should look. This is the way our lives and our institutions shall look. So continue the conversation. Help us work together and work together with the people that you've met tonight or people that you'll meet tomorrow. But the one thing that I definitely want us to do is, now that we've gone through 2 of these, is to make sure that we are internalizing what we've learned and that we are trying to act on what we've learned. It won't be easy. It won't be smooth. We're going to make some mistakes. But if we don't try, then we're never going to get over ourselves. Thanks for coming tonight. See you in January.